The hospital at night was a different world entirely. The buzzing of fluorescent lights replaced the chaos of daytime, and footsteps echoed louder in the near-empty halls. It was during these hours that everything seemed to breathe a little slower, as though the building itself had exhaled after a long day. Dr. Nathan Hale moved through this quiet like a shadow, his white coat fluttering behind him with a familiar rhythm. At 43, he had grown accustomed to silence. He welcomed it. It gave him space to think, to retreat into the routines that kept everything in order. Diagnoses, charts, medication adjustments, predictable, clean lines in a world that rarely made sense. The nurse's station was nearly deserted, save for the faint glow of a desk lamp and the steady clacking of a keyboard. Julian Torres sat there, shoulders slightly hunched, his attention fixed on the screen. Nathan observed him from the hallway for a moment before stepping inside. Julian was still relatively new. In his mid-30s, he had transferred from a large metropolitan hospital a few months ago. Unlike many who brought the city's rushed energy with them, Julian had a calming presence. He moved with quiet confidence, always aware, always grounded. There was something about the way he listened, genuinely, attentively, that had begun to stand out to Nathan more than he expected. Nathan didn't speak as he passed behind Julian's chair, and Julian didn't turn around. It was an unspoken understanding. No need to fill the space with pleasantries at this hour. Instead, Nathan moved to the break room, where the coffee was cold and the vending machine hummed like a distant storm. It was the kind of night that invited introspection. Rain tapped softly against the windows, and the world outside was a blur of lights and shadows. Nathan leaned against the counter, sipping lukewarm coffee, his mind drifting, not to patients or test results, but to the weight he often carried in silence. Years of being everything to everyone. A provider, a professional, a friend when needed, but rarely ever just a man. Alone, human. A soft knock on the break room door pulled him from his thoughts. Julian stepped inside, holding a fresh mug of coffee, the steam curling upward like breath on a winter morning. He handed it to Nathan without a word, then sat across from him at the small table near the window. There was no rush in their movements. The silence between them was not awkward. It had a rhythm, almost like music heard faintly through the walls. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Two people existing in the same quiet, finding an odd comfort in the stillness of shared presence. Nathan watched Julian out of the corner of his eye. The younger man stared at the rain as though it held secrets only he could understand. There was something behind his gaze, a weariness that didn't match his age, a kind of emotional limp from carrying things too heavy for too long. Nathan recognized it. He wore the same expression sometimes when he caught his reflection in the mirror at 3 a.m. The coffee cooled between them, untouched. Minutes passed. Somewhere down the hall, a machine beeped and then went silent again. The storm outside grew steadier, wrapping the hospital in a soft percussive lullaby. Julian finally shifted in his chair, not to speak, but simply to breathe deeper. It was a small movement, yet it felt like a quiet declaration. Nathan found his fingers tightening around the mug, not out of nervousness but awareness. Awareness of the other man's presence. Awareness of something neither of them had acknowledged yet. The night dragged on, and still they remained, tethered by unspoken things. Nathan's mind wandered to memories he rarely revisited, of past choices, of emotional doors long shut and locked. And yet here he was, sitting in a quiet room, with someone who made the silence feel full instead of empty. Julian eventually stood, giving Nathan a small, tired smile, not forced but honest in its simplicity. Then he left, returning to his station without a word. Nathan remained for a while longer, his thoughts swirling like the storm outside. He realized then that this wasn't just another quiet night shift. There was something different in the air, not dramatic or urgent, but present, real. A thread had been pulled, ever so slightly, and something within him had started to unravel, not in a destructive way, but in a way that hinted at possibility. The next night, Nathan found himself lingering near the nurse's station longer than usual. The nights began to follow a pattern. Nathan noticed it in the smallest things. How Julian would brew fresh coffee right before the lull of midnight. How he'd sometimes leave an extra pen on Nathan's desk without saying a word. How his shifts always seemed to overlap with Nathan's just enough to feel intentional, though never spoken aloud. It wasn't routine in the way most hospital things were. It was something gentler, unspoken but consistent. Their conversations remained minimal, but the silences between them started to feel like shared blankets on a cold night. Unassuming, yet comforting. Nathan had spent years mastering the art of emotional detachment, and yet Julian's presence was slipping past that armor without resistance. One night, long after the last patient had been discharged and the fluorescent lights dimmed to their softest setting, Nathan wandered into the small staff lounge and found Julian sitting on the worn couch, a thick novel open in his lap. The room was dim, the only light coming from the soft table lamp beside him, casting golden shadows on the white walls. Nathan didn't speak. Instead, he moved toward the counter and poured himself a cup of tea, something Julian had brought from home and left near the mugs, labeled quietly with a sticky note, chamomile. Helps with long nights. He took a seat across from him, and for a while, they simply existed together. Julian's eyes moved steadily across the page, while Nathan let the warmth of the tea seep into his fingers. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees, and the faint rustling leaves echoed through the barely cracked window. It wasn't connection in the traditional sense. There were no confessions, no shared laughter or sudden moments of revelation. It was subtler than that. A shift, a presence. Nathan could feel his thoughts growing quieter in Julian's company, the usual hum of pressure in his mind softening to something that resembled peace. Every so often, Julian would look up from his book and meet Nathan's gaze. They wouldn't smile. They wouldn't speak. But the acknowledgement felt stronger than words could ever carry. Nathan had been in the business of healing others for decades. He had touched countless lives, eased pain, extended time, but rarely did anyone pause long enough to consider what weight he carried himself. Julian did not ask about it, and perhaps that was what made it so powerful. He didn't probe. He simply stayed. During their shifts, Nathan began to notice how Julian interacted with patients, not with scripted kindness, but with genuine care. He remembered the way Julian had comforted a trembling elderly man earlier that evening, crouching beside his bed and resting a calm hand on his arm. He remembered the soft tone in his voice when he reassured a frightened child during an injection. These moments lingered. Nathan found himself drawn to the nurse's station more often, offering unneeded chart reviews or casual check-ins that even he recognized as excuses. But Julian never questioned them. He welcomed them with the same quiet warmth as always. One particularly long night, the air heavy with the kind of stillness that settles in the hours before dawn, Nathan sat at the end of a hallway bench. He had just finished reviewing a complex case, his mind a fog of medical jargon and emotional fatigue. Julian appeared silently beside him and handed him a wrapped granola bar. "You skipped dinner," he said softly, one of the rare moments he spoke first. Nathan took it, their fingers brushing briefly, and for that fleeting second, something stirred between them. Nothing explosive, just awareness. A recognition that they were both navigating something tender and real, though undefined. He unwrapped the bar and ate in silence, Julian sitting beside him, close but not too close. No more words were needed. From that night on, small kindnesses became their language. Julian began bringing 2 mugs to the lounge instead of 1. Nathan printed out an article he thought Julian might like and left it tucked inside his locker. A playlist was quietly shared one evening when Julian left his phone unlocked, and Nathan noticed it playing low, atmospheric music he himself had been listening to recently. The next night, Julian played a similar track when Nathan entered the room. None of these gestures were acknowledged aloud, and yet they said everything. Nathan, who had once thought of silence as a fortress, now found it to be a bridge. A place where healing didn't have to be loud, and understanding didn't have to be verbalized. Their connection remained within the boundaries of professionalism, but something delicate had started to bloom within that space. Something made of glances and gestures, quiet comfort and shared stillness. As the days passed, Nathan began to realize how rare it was to simply be noticed without demand, to be accepted not for what he could give or solve, but for who he quietly was. And Julian, gentle, observant Julian, offered him that without even trying. The next time they were scheduled together, Nathan found himself looking forward to the night, not because of the work, not because of the routine, but because he knew Julian would be there, not asking for anything, not pushing, just being. And somehow that was everything. The third week of night shifts brought with it a hush that seemed deeper than usual. The air inside the hospital grew cooler, the fluorescent lights slightly dimmer, and the echo of distant footsteps softer, like whispers fading into darkness. The world outside moved on, unseen through tinted windows, while inside, time seemed to slow down and fold in on itself. Nathan had always thought of night as a space between lives, a bridge between the day's responsibilities and the illusions of rest. But lately, it had begun to take on a new shape. He found himself not dreading the empty hours, but anticipating them. He had stopped asking why. Julian had a way of moving through the hospital that didn't disturb the stillness. His presence, though never demanding, had begun to fill Nathan's thoughts in quiet moments. Not as a distraction, but as a presence that lingered, a light left on in the background of his mind. One night, after an unusually long string of patient updates and paperwork, Nathan returned to the break room to find it dimly lit, music playing low from a small speaker on the windowsill. The track was familiar, soft piano and ambient tones, something Nathan had once mentioned in passing during a rare exchange. Julian was already there, leaning back in the armchair, a book resting on his chest as his eyes drifted toward the ceiling. He looked up as Nathan entered but said nothing. He simply shifted slightly in his seat, making space with a quiet glance. Nathan joined him, sitting on the opposite side of the room. He loosened his tie and let the silence gather around them like mist. The music filled the corners of the space, a quiet thread tying their breaths together. Eventually, Julian sat up and reached for the second cup on the table beside him. He handed it to Nathan without comment. It was warm, familiar chamomile again, a shared ritual that had developed without words. Nathan sipped slowly, watching the way the light softened Julian's features. He noticed things he hadn't before. The way Julian's hair curled slightly behind his ear, the almost imperceptible lines around his eyes that deepened when he exhaled. They didn't speak. Instead, they sat with the kind of quiet that can only exist between two people who have begun to understand each other without trying. The clock ticked toward midnight, and somewhere deep in the building, a door closed with a soft click. Nathan felt the weight of the day slide off his shoulders. Not all at once, but piece by piece, like a coat unbuttoned slowly in a warm room. "I stayed late on purpose," Julian said eventually, his voice barely above the music. Nathan turned to him, not surprised, just quietly aware. "I didn't want to go home yet." There was no elaboration. He didn't need to say more, and Nathan didn't press. Instead, he let the admission settle between them, grounding the moment. Nathan shifted forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his cup cradled in both hands. He spoke carefully, his voice low. "Sometimes I stay longer than I should," he said. "Not because there's more to do, just because it's easier." Julian looked at him then, really looked. There was no curiosity in his gaze, only understanding. The moment stretched between them. It wasn't dramatic or emotional, but something shifted. It wasn't an invitation or a confession. It was recognition. Julian stood, not abruptly, but with intention. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the couch beside Nathan. Not close enough to touch, but enough to feel the warmth between them. They remained like that for a while, the space between them charged with quiet tension, full of everything that hadn't yet been said. Nathan felt something stir inside him. Not longing exactly, not fear either, but a strange sense of being seen, fully and gently. Julian's hands were folded in his lap, his eyes on the window. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft and steady. "I used to think I'd get used to being alone," Julian said, his tone matter-of-fact. That I'd stop noticing it. But some nights it's louder than others. Nathan nodded, his voice caught in his throat. He knew that sound. He'd heard it echo through his own life for years. And then, without quite realizing it, their shoulders brushed. It was nothing, an accident of proximity, but neither pulled away. Nathan's breath caught, and Julian looked down at where their arms had touched. Still, neither moved. There was no kiss, no confission, no trembling hands, only stillness and awareness. Julian reached for his tea, and Nathan noticed the faint tremble in his fingers. That was all. That was enough. A breakthrough didn't have to be loud. Sometimes it was just a shared silence that no longer felt empty. When Julian left the room that night, Nathan didn't follow. But he stayed a little longer than usual, staring at the seat beside him, feeling the memory of a presence that didn't ask anything from him, except maybe to be. And for the first time in a long time, Nathan thought, maybe he could. Morning arrived with little fanfare. The corridors of the hospital were beginning to stir again. Machines beeped with fresh urgency, and nurses in new scrubs moved purposefully down the halls. But inside Nathan, something had quieted. Something subtle had shifted during the night that couldn't be undone by routine or daylight. He passed Julian in the hallway, just before shift change. A brief nod, a small upward twitch at the corners of their mouths. No words, no pause, just a thread of knowing that stretched silently between them. The world around them buzzed with its usual rhythm. But Nathan walked away feeling as though something soft had been placed in his hands, and he hadn't yet figured out what to do with it. Over the next few nights, the rhythm of their interactions evolved with understated grace. Nothing was said aloud, nothing needed to be, but their shared silences deepened into something steadier, something that carried weight. The way Julian lingered a bit longer in the break room. The way Nathan found himself preparing a second cup of tea without thinking. These gestures became anchors, subtle, quiet affirmations that neither of them was drifting alone anymore. Nathan had never considered himself a man drawn to routine outside of medicine. But now, each night he arrived at the hospital, he found himself scanning for signs of Julian. A flash of dark hair behind the nurse's station. The distinct rhythm of footsteps he had come to recognize without looking. The soft shuffle of a chair in the staff lounge. They never discussed what was growing between them. No labels. No promises. It was something that existed outside of definition. And perhaps that was what made it feel so real. One evening, after a particularly intense shift, Nathan was reviewing patient files at his desk when a knock came on the door. Julian stood there, still in his scrubs, a slight sheen of tiredness clinging to him. He didn't step inside, just leaned against the frame with a softness that had become familiar. "I brought you something," he said, holding up a small Tupperware container. His voice was casual, almost teasing. "Not hospital food." Nathan raised an eyebrow, mildly amused. "Vegetarian curry," Julian added. "Made too much." Nathan accepted it with a nod, their fingers brushing again. The contact was fleeting, yet steady. Like each time before, it left an echo in its wake. Later, as Nathan ate alone in the staff room, he found himself lingering over each bite, not just because the food was good, but because it came from Julian's hands. It was a kindness with history, a quiet gesture with roots. That night, the hospital was unusually quiet. The lull between emergencies gave way to stillness that settled like a blanket. Nathan made his way to the rooftop balcony, a little-known spot behind the stairwell where staff sometimes went to breathe. He found Julian there already, arms folded on the railing, eyes on the horizon. The city below twinkled under the stars, and the wind tugged gently at his sleeves. Nathan stepped up beside him without a word. They stood shoulder to shoulder, breathing in the cool air, letting it settle between them. "There's something peaceful about watching everything from above," Julian murmured eventually. "Like it all makes sense for a moment." Nathan nodded. He didn't trust his voice to say anything meaningful. "Not yet." Julian glanced sideways. "You come up here often?" "Not really," Nathan replied after a pause. "But maybe I should." There was a stretch of silence that followed, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full of possibilities. Julian's eyes remained on the skyline, but Nathan could sense the tension in his shoulders had eased. That unspoken weight Julian carried, the one Nathan had noticed on his first day, seemed lighter now, even if only slightly. "I didn't think I'd ever feel comfortable around someone like this again," Julian said quietly, not turning his head. "But I do." The admission struck Nathan gently. He didn't respond. He simply let it settle. Minutes passed. Stars moved incrementally in the sky. Somewhere below, a siren wailed briefly before fading back into the hum of the night. Eventually, Julian straightened and turned to leave. Before he stepped away, his hand brushed Nathan's arm. Just once, just enough to be felt. Nathan remained on the rooftop after he left, staring out at the city. He felt it then, in the stillness, something had opened. A door, a window, a wall. Whatever it was, it would not be closed again. He didn't fear it. In fact, he welcomed it. There was a calmness that followed their rooftop moment, the kind that lingers in the body longer than words. Nathan felt it in the way his shoulders no longer sat as high, in the stillness that no longer felt heavy. The quiet they had shared wasn't just the absence of noise. It had become a presence of its own, a soft acknowledgement of something neither of them had dared to name. Days passed, then another week. The routine of the hospital carried on, but within it, something had shifted. Nathan began to notice the way his thoughts drifted toward Julian even when they weren't on the same shift. He thought of him in the morning, when the hallway was still dim and filled with the scent of fresh coffee. He thought of him at night, in the space between turning off the bedside lamp and sleep. He wasn't falling in love quickly. It wasn't a whirlwind. It was steadier, more like discovering a quiet road he'd never known was there, one that seemed to lead somewhere worth walking. Julian continued to show up in the small ways that mattered. A thermos left for Nathan when their shifts didn't align. A note scribbled in the margins of a shared patient file. "You were right. Good call on the dosage." There were no declarations, no drama, but something built, stone by stone, in the moments they chose to show up for each other without asking. One evening, near the end of Nathan's shift, he received a text. It was simple. "Still around? Thought I'd take a walk before heading home." Nathan glanced at the clock. He didn't need to think. "Meet me out front," he replied. The night air outside was crisp, touched by the lingering scent of rain from earlier. The street was quiet, the city around them winding down. Julian stood beneath the awning, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed but alert. Nathan joined him, and for a moment, they just stood there, breathing in the quiet. They walked without a destination, side by side, letting the rhythm of their steps fill the silence. The sidewalk glistened faintly under the streetlights, and their shadows stretched long ahead of them. Julian eventually broke the stillness with a half-smile. "Feels strange to be outside the hospital with you." Nathan nodded, his voice calm. "Strange, but good." Their steps slowed as they reached a park nearby, one of those small, well-kept patches of green that often went unnoticed during the day. A bench sat beneath a wide tree, and they settled there, the night curling around them like a blanket. Nathan looked ahead, at the empty path stretching into the trees. "I used to think I'd gotten too good at being alone," he said slowly, "that it was safer." Julian didn't look at him, but his voice was steady. "It is safer, but not better." Nathan exhaled, his hands resting loosely in his lap. "No, not better." A quiet passed between them, not uncomfortable, but full. Julian leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I don't want to go back to pretending I don't feel anything," he said, his words measured, deliberate. "Not after this." Nathan turned to him, watching the way the light touched his profile. There was no hesitation in his voice when he replied. "You don't have to." For the first time, Julian looked at him directly. And in that moment, with nothing more than the space of a breath between them, something solidified. No promises were made. No boundaries were crossed. But the space between them no longer felt like a gap. It felt like a bridge. Later, back at the hospital, they lingered by the entrance. Nathan looked toward the building, then back to Julian. "Dinner next week?" he asked quietly. Julian's response came with the faintest smile, one that reached all the way to his eyes. "I'd like that." Nathan nodded, and they parted ways without needing to say more. As he walked to his car, Nathan felt something he hadn't in years: anticipation. Not of chaos or crisis, but of someone, of something growing where he least expected it. The next few nights passed with the quiet joy of expectation. They didn't rush anything. They didn't pretend it wasn't complicated. But every shared glance, every subtle gesture built on something real. When they did finally sit across from each other outside the hospital, at a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street, it felt like an extension of all their silent nights. The conversation flowed gently, filled with stories they hadn't yet shared, laughter that came easily, and pauses that no longer felt like absences. Nathan watched Julian speak, listened to the shape of his thoughts, and realized how rare it was to feel both safe and seen in someone's company. Julian was not just a momentary comfort. He was a possibility. That night, as they stood under the soft glow of a street lamp, Nathan didn't hesitate when he reached for Julian's hand. Their fingers intertwined naturally, as though they had done it 100 times before. They didn't need to say what it was. They both knew. It was the beginning of something true.